Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach, a podcast that unpacks international trade and how it affects you without putting you to sleep.
Welcome to Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach. I'm Lori Wallach. Today, we are very fortunate to have two guests with us. Cecilia Olivet is an advisor to the left group in the European Parliament. She has enormous expertise in the topic we're going to talk about today, which is the amazing shift in the European Union with respect to the investor-state dispute settlement system, or ISDS. Those are those corporate tribunals where corporations can sue governments and demand compensation, unlimited sums, I might add, outside court systems for any kind of domestic policy for the environment, public health, that undermines what they think are special corporate rights and their expected future profits. Cecilia has worked as an advisor to the Ecuadorian government when it was rethinking these agreements, as well as a long-time staffer at the Transnational Institute, which was a key part of the Pan-European Coalition, Seattle to Brussels, working for decades to get to the moment we have now arrived at. The other guest we're fortunate to have joining us today is Fabian Flues. He works at Powershift, which is a German-based organization focused on economic justice through the lens of trade and raw materials. They're doing a lot of great work around climate-related issues, but also the impact of trade and globalization on economic justice in Europe and the world. And Powershift has had a huge role over many years in fighting ISDS. So welcome both.
Thanks for having us.
So to start out, Cecilia, what is the Energy Charter Treaty and why is it important?
The Energy Charter Treaty is an international agreement that has the potential to undermine government action to combat climate change, but also other policies that governments can implement to protect people or the environment. The Energy Charter Treaty is an international investment protection agreement. These are treaties that allow foreign investors to sue states, but not in the national courts that we have in the different countries. They can go straight to international arbitration tribunals. And these tribunals are not accountable, so the cases are decided by arbitrators that charge per hour of work. So it's a system that I would say rigged in favor of the investors. And the Energy Charter Treaty in particular came very big agreement because it involves many countries, all of the European countries, but also many countries in Central Asia, also Japan, and it has been used. It's one of the investment protection treaties that has been used the most. And in the particular context of today, where every climate scientist around the world is saying we need to phase out from fossil fuels, this is a treaty that has been putting obstacles on the way, and it's just outrageous.
So when I saw the news that the European Union, as the whole European Union, that there was a vote to get out of this treaty, first of all, I did a little happy dance and I cheered for my colleagues and friends in Europe who achieved this, but it's shocking. A lot of the European countries, like the United States, were the key champions of these corporate rights and this extraordinary set of corporate privileged enforcement powers in ISDS. Germany, the Netherlands have been major fans of investor-state dispute settlements because there have been big multinational corporations in these countries. Some of it's even left over from the colonial era, who had huge investments, some of it natural resources, all over the global south. This is a huge shift. What is your sense of how that happened?
So I think you're totally right, Laurie, that European countries are at the center of the entire ISDS system. It's really the kind of global hub where most cases overall emanate from. And European countries have been pushing investment treaties like the ECT for decades. What changed to some degree was that under the Energy Charter Treaty, it was suddenly European countries that themselves were attacked by investors. So we had many cases against European states. Some of those countries imagined arrogantly that they would never be targeted by an investor because they do policy properly or they have great courts. So why would an investor go and use ISDS? And then when the first cases start hitting them, they suddenly totally rethink the way they look at investment treaties and what it means for them. So the Energy Charter Treaty was sticking out because 2/3 of all cases, so almost 100 cases, were from European investors against other European countries, targeting some of the big European countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Spain in particular. And so those countries suddenly saw the Energy Charter Treaty from an offensive interest, where they would protect their own investors, to a defensive interest, where they would need to do something to protect their policy space and their fiscal space. And so that was part of the reason why some governments shifted.
So in the US, we have a saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And it seems like in this instance, there was sort of to mix the metaphors of the barnyard, the chickens came home to roost, which is to say, suddenly the European countries are on the losing side. Were there some specific cases that really started this turnaround?
Yeah, there were a couple of cases that were launched in relatively quick succession against the country that's generated most ISDS cases after the United States, the Netherlands, that really became iconic for what ISDS can do to the energy transition and to the fight against climate change. So the Netherlands had to develop a plan to phase out coal power in the country to meet their Paris climate targets. And they did that by ending the burning of coal by the year 2030. The two major investors in Dutch coal power plants were two German companies. And from the beginning, when the law was still discussed, threatened an ISDS case against the Netherlands to try to water down the law, which we know as regulatory chill. When they didn't get their way, they started those cases, which amounted to 2.5 billion euros or 2.7 billion US dollars in compensation. And they said specifically that they didn't go to the Dutch courts because they could get more money out of ISDS. And those were the two first cases against the Netherlands. And it really shocked a lot of European countries outside the Netherlands as well, because this was one of the central climate policies of a country being attacked through ISDS, with an investor not saying we don't have access to courts, but just saying we want to get more money out of this. This is why we're using this system. And so in the Netherlands, that caused really reconsideration of their position in the Energy Charter Treaty, but it also had ripple effects on other European countries that suddenly realized if the Netherlands could be attacked, then the same could happen to us. And those two cases really kind of changed the discourse in Europe from something where those cases were hypothetical to something where they were very real and threatening.
The awareness among European countries started when they started to receive lawsuits. So when they started to be sued themselves, they realized that this was a system that was not only to protect their own investors, but they could also be heard themselves. Italy was also sued by British companies for banning offshore oil developments. But there are other cases that have exemplified what in practice could happen with this type of treaties was not compatible with the goals of Paris Climate Agreement and the need to phase out from fossil fuels. And that awakened governments to say, hold on a minute, how could this be possible? But we also need to see that this came as the result of a massive pressure from a huge people's movement around Europe that built knowledge and that raised awareness about the dangers of this treaty, but also the investment arbitration system as a whole. And the combination of this pressure from a huge movement, but also climate scientists, young people, denouncing this treaty, together with the realization that they were starting to get sued and the cases were piling up, led to this shift. However, I have to warn that it's not all rose. I mean, they don't want to get sued, therefore they are getting out of this treaty, but at the same time, they are continuing to negotiate investment protection in trade agreements with third countries in the global south, where there is no real danger of being sued themselves. So they're happy to maintain investment protection to protect their own transnational corporations abroad, as long as there is no risk of them being sued. And this is where we see double standards. And so the discourse changes depending on which treaty are we talking about.
This was a massive civil society campaign that was so impressive. And not only is resulting in this change, but from my perspective, is what saved all of us from an EU-US free trade agreement called TTIP. As someone who tried to do a lot of campaigning on this issue in the US, it was a real amazing campaign and strategy that has led to this outcome. And I want to call that out for everyone who's a campaigner who's listening, who thinks they're up against really hard odds. These were really hard odds. And so I would like to have you share a little bit of the campaign, when you started it, how you thought about it. It's such a successful effort. Congratulations. It's truly amazing work, and we should all learn from it.
Thank you, Laurie. That's very kind of you to say. And I agree that when we started off with a campaign, we weren't convinced that we would win it. Actually, we would probably have put the odds somewhere at the single digits, maybe. So we thought it would really be an uphill battle. And I think there were a couple of things that really helped the campaign. One was that it came on the back of the kind of biggest social movement against climate change, the Fridays for Future movement in Europe, that really changed the discourse around climate and made it a central political issue. It was the students, school and university students in particular, who went out of class, out of their schools and universities every Friday to strike for the climate. So they were striking their school attendance or university attendance in big marches. And at the peak of it, we had, I think, 1.4 million students and their supporters in the streets in Germany. It really became a mass movement. Then maybe looking at the campaign itself, something that was that really worked for us was using the climate frame. The dangers that are inherent in the ISDS mechanism was much harder to communicate, and it often fell kind of flat both in public communication and with policymakers. But talking about the danger to the energy transition and climate change was what really worked and where people started paying attention. And then a third thing that was very helpful for us was this was an energy investment treaty. So on the one hand, the investment policy people, the same people that negotiated these treaties for 20, 30, 40 years and are totally sucked into the system, were involved, but also people from energy ministries and climate ministries that sometimes heard about ISDS for the first time. And like almost everyone else in the world, except for those negotiators, they thought it was outrageous. And having them in the mix and them co-determining the policy really changed something. I think had it just been up to the trade and investment treaty people, we would have had a much harder time.
Do you think there is some prospect or appetite in official EU corners to start thinking about changing the existing ISDS structures in bilateral investment treaties, in free trade agreements, to reverse this plan you've discussed of having investor protections in new free trade agreements? Or what can civil society or parliamentarians do to shift that?
I'm not that optimistic, to be honest, because as I said, yes, the European Union has already done a little bit of a rethinking in the sense that they have a new model of investment protection where they have slightly tweaked some of the elements of the ISDS system, but they are not structural changes. They are changes that I would say take the edges of the most egregious elements of the ISDS, but maintain the essence of it. And that's as far as the EU, at least at the moment, was willing to go. The exit from the Energy Charter Treaty is really because the majority of the cases under the ECT were cases against European countries by European investors. So there was a massive problem there of European investors from Germany suing the Netherlands or from the UK suing Italy. So that became unacceptable. But when it comes to protecting the German or French multinational corporations abroad, they are happy to maintain it and they don't want to get rid of it. So I think that push will need to come from third countries for something to change. Civil society, I would expect, will continue pushing and to show these double standards.
The fact that European countries were feeling actually the impact of ISDS on their public finances or also on their administrative capacity really made a difference. So it will be harder to attack those treaties where it's mostly European investors suing other countries. But I think there are a few reasons to be hopeful. The investment policy people, the same people that negotiated these treaties for 20, 30, 40 years and are totally sucked into the system, were involved, but also people from energy ministries and climate ministries that sometimes heard about ISDS for the first time, and like almost everyone else in the world except for those negotiators, they thought it was outrageous. And having them in the mix and them co-determining the policy really changed something. Climate and energy people are now much more aware of the dangers that those treaties pose to a policy area where we need significant government intervention and where we need basically an organized devaluing of assets, namely the assets of the fossil fuel companies. So that's exactly what investment treaties are designed to prevent. So there's a fundamental conflict that just can't be wished away.
So that's very interesting. There were people who were in the climate ministries who themselves said, oh, this has got to go.
Exactly. Yeah. They suddenly saw the threat for their own ambitions, their policies, their proposals, and they thought, this is outrageous. We can't be constrained by something like this in our energy policy, which is already challenging enough. So I think it's an experience as trade campaigners that we make again and again, that once we start explaining the principles and ideas and the workings of ISDS to people who haven't heard about it, everyone thinks it's an outrage. And only the people who have been long enough on the inside think it's something normal.
The catch is that the protection for investors will be maintained 15 years. We still have this sunset clause, this so-called zombie clause, because the treaty, even if it dies, the protection lives on.
So this zombie clause, or sometimes we call it the hangover clause, what are strategies to make sure these corporate rights don't strangle countries for an extra 10 or 15 years?
What it's called an inter se agreement. So it's an agreement among the different member states to say they're not going to sue each other. The question is then how arbitrators, these unaccountable arbitrators, will react to it. And this is what, so far, even the European Court of Justice saying that investors cannot use investment treaties to sue within the EU. The European Court of Justice have indicated this is not legal within the EU, and arbitrators have ignored over and over again. So that's why there is an anger also about how arbitrators only look at the text of these agreements without taking into consideration any other legislation, either national or supranational, other commitments of international level like the Paris Agreement and other international agreements that governments have signed to decide whether they can accept these cases, they can rule on them or not, and how do they rule on them. So they only look at the text of the International Protection Agreement, and in that regard, then they would take on the case and in most cases rule in favor of the investors also because they have an inherent incentive to do that because they charge per hour, and the more that investors sue, the more cases that they will get as well. So it's a system that is geared towards having results mainly in favor of foreign investors.
So to put this in perspective, dear listeners, there are currently 56 countries that are signed up. Of the countries in the European Union, there could be an agreement not to sue each other. But this is how crazy the investor-state dispute settlement system is. The sovereign signatories to the relevant treaty say that they're out and they agree not to sue each other, this corporate court could still take the cases with individual arbitrators, 3 of them at a time, deciding, regardless of what the sovereign said, they are going to have this case anyway and allow an investor to attack a country, demand taxpayer compensation of an unlimited sum over some pro-climate policy, despite the country having renounced the treaty. Just want to be really clear how outrageous this is. Cecilia, what do you think is going to happen next? What do you see as sort of the arc of what happens next in this whole process?
We are going to continue pushing for termination of not just this type of multilateral investment treaties, but bilateral investment treaties, big multinationals that bring no benefits to governments, to people, to the environment, and have no reason really to exist, because the only justification that was put forward to sign them in the first place was that they would help attract foreign investment. And over the years, we have seen this has not happened. There is no correlation between signing this type of treaties and attracting foreign investment. This was proven in cases like Ecuador, India, Indonesia, but also in the European Union. So the reason to exist is not there, only the risks are there. And for that reason, we hope that we will continue this path of exiting this toxic system.
Cecilia, Fabian, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing all about this incredibly important development, and obviously for your many years of work and that of all of your colleagues and partners across Europe that help make this possible. It is a march in the right direction to have the U.S. in the USMCA, NAFTA renegotiation, get rid of ISDS with Canada, to have it reduced with Mexico, to have the Biden administration promise no new ISDS. But this development in Europe is really stunning. And it is the result of literally decades of work by civil society. So for anyone who is up against a very hard slog on any issue, we should all be inspired by this. Listeners, until next time, this is Rethinking Trade with Lori Wallach.